Well, first of all, many thanks indeed to the organizers for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be having this discussion. I look forward to the Q&A. My talk in the next 15 minutes will be about insecurity policies and far-right party support. And at the onset, I just want to note, first of all, that I'm calling them far-right parties and not populist parties, and this for two reasons. One is normative. I don't think it's the same sort of threat to combine these two things. And the second one, more importantly perhaps for our purpose, is analytical, namely that populism and far-right is not the same thing to the extent that far-right parties have three characteristics. They're populist, but they're also nationalist and sometimes nativist, and they're often radicalist or extremist in their relationship to the system, right? So, and I think that makes a difference for how we think about it and for what sort of threat that they represent. So I want to make 3 points. First, I'd like to review the state of the art in literature and argue that the way it's currently been discussed perhaps is missing the interactions between different forms of insecurities, economic, cultural, and personal, which is the second point. And third, and not surprisingly given the audience here, I'd like to perhaps advocate for a closer role as to what sort of what policies can do, in particular, how they might help address the rise of far-right parties. But before I do so, let me just, to fix ideas, present you a picture that sort of echoes what Martin was just saying, namely that if we look at the rise of far-right parties, it hasn't happened overnight since 2008. However, we classify countries and parties. What we see is that they start emerging to a limited extent, perhaps, from the late 1980s, and then you have really a big increase in the early 1990s. And then in the early 2000s, you start having a fall before, with the crisis, the number of different economic refugees and quote-unquote migration crisis, or perceived to be. Then you have a second rise, a sort of third rise, big rise, since 2008 or so. And typically how scholars have tried to understand it is as a sort of two-dimensional problem, whereby obviously you need to have some sort of a demand for these parties coming from the bottom, from the population. And then that demand is met by some supply-side factors, either in terms of the way the electoral system is structured, whether it's open to these challenger parties, or indeed in the ways in which parties compete and the party system is structured. On the demand side, there is a kind of battle between economic grievances and cultural grievances, and with the economic crisis, the usual suspect was obviously that it was the economic crisis that was leading to this rise that I've just shown you. But increasingly, there was a bit of a puzzle in the fact that actually, if you looked at correlations between economic concerns and problems on the one hand and far-right party support on the other, what you saw is that actually correlation was pretty low, which has led a lot of the field, at least in political science, to say, well, therefore, it must either be cultural concerns, or it has to be something to do with the supply side. And the economy is kind of irrelevant. And what I want to argue is that I think this is kind of perhaps a bit hasty, partly because, in fact, different insecurities might interact, partly because we're missing the policy element from this picture, and partly because both economy and culture could matter, but in different ways, which I'd like to set out here. And so the way I think about this is you can think of the population as having different sorts of risks. There are risk factors that can expose you and translate into some form of insecurity. And so, for instance, in the case of economic risks, you could imagine that you're in a precarious work or on a low income, and that exposes you to a degree of economic insecurity. And this insecurity then typically feeds into support for the far right, either because you're unhappy with the system, so it's kind of a protest vote, or indeed because no other parties are addressing your grievances, and you feel that perhaps far-right parties might address them. And that has something to do with how the left has positioned itself in that sort of 2 or 3 decades. But once you start seeing it in this way, what you see is that these different risks would interact, and indeed that there is a role for public policies to kick in and address the ways in which these risks are distributed in the population and the ways in which these risks might or might not translate into insecurity. So point number 1, bringing policies back in. Point number 2, I think by and large what the field is doing now is they're saying, what is the probability of you voting for the far right given certain concerns you have, cultural or economic? And if cultural concerns have a stronger predictive power, we will conclude that this is, quote unquote, more important to explain the far right. And I think this is sort of confusing the size of different groups and the propensity of these groups to vote for far-right parties. And I'll elaborate what I mean by this in the next slide. And thirdly, we have to think about not just economy versus culture versus other forms of risks, but how these different risks interact and overlap. And to some extent, you could think of people in working class communities having both quote-unquote high levels of economic insecurity and also having cultural grievances. And these two things overlap so much that sometimes it's hard to actually disentangle what is going on there. But I think it's important to do so. So if you think of individuals as having different characteristics or being part of different social groups, you can then think that these characteristics might expose them to more or less risks. And indeed, this is how public economics or a lot of social policy is thinking of those things. I am in a particular group. I am unemployed, for instance. And that unemployment exposes me to a degree of insecurity, which then makes me perhaps vote for far-right parties. But something that's kind of perhaps obvious to the policy community, but hasn't been so much considered in far-right studies, is obviously the extent to which this risk translates into insecurity has to depend on the policy environment. So for instance, if I'm unemployed and on 10% of the average wage, it's not the same that if I'm unemployed and the unemployment benefit system is replacing 80% of the average wage, right? In one case, I might be in absolute poverty. In another case, I might actually, still be in a middle-class lifestyle. Huh? So think, of French unemployment benefits versus other unemployment benefits, right? So if this is true, we have to think of the ways in which policies can perhaps intervene and shape the extent to which different risks materialize themselves into insecurity and how this in turn then leads to far-right voting. You then have, in a way, different ways of thinking about these linkages. And what we've been doing with colleagues is to think of different social groups with different social risks, and then think of the sort of policies that could address these risks, and then calculate the probability that someone in a particular group votes for far-right parties and or feel insecure as a function of the policy in place. So for instance, you could do this at an individual level, and you could say, if I am unemployed in a particular European country with a particular benefit system, what is the probability that I will vote for the far-right as opposed to an unemployed person in another system, with different levels of unemployment benefits. And you could also do it at the national level and map the extent to which national electoral results correlate with the unemployment rate in that particular election, depending on the benefit system. And you can do that for a whole range of social groups and policies. And I think this is perhaps not ideal in some ways, which we can discuss, but I think it helps us to get into thinking about the ways in which policy might help stem the rise of the far-right. The second point is perhaps slightly more nerdy, but nevertheless important. A lot of the predictive models now being used in political science conclude that cultural concerns have higher predictive power, meaning if I hold, say, racist views, the probability that I then vote for the far-right is very high as compared to, I don't know, being on a low income or in unemployment. Conclusion, it matters more, except that the size of the groups is being missed, right? Which is that you could imagine, for instance, just to take an extreme and silly example, but to fix ideas, you can imagine that you have 110 people in a country. 10 people are hardcore nationalists, 5 of which vote for the far-right. 50% probability of voting for the far-right. The 100 that remain have economic insecurity. 20 vote for the far-right. 20% probability. You fit a model on this, you conclude that holding hardcore nationalist attitudes is very, very important, therefore explains the rise of the far-right. Except that in the example that I've just given, you have 20 people voting for far-right who are economically insecure, and 5 voting for far-right who are culturally insecure or hardcore nationalist. So does this really explain the rise of the far-right? And the way you can therefore think about it, and the way we've been thinking about it with colleagues, to say, well, actually, successful far-right parties are able to coalesce a high proportion of people with cultural concerns, the core electorate of the far-right, and perhaps a smaller share of a much larger group of people who have economic concerns. Just to give you an example with European Social Survey data of most EU countries from 2002 to 2016, you can calculate the probability of someone voting for the far-right, depending on whether or not they think immigration is good for a country's economy, and depending on whether or not they think immigration is bad for the country's economy. And what you see in a way is that obviously someone who thinks that immigration is very bad for the country's economy and very bad for the country's culture is extremely likely to vote for far right, 14%, for a sort of cross-sample average of about 6%. But, and someone who thinks both are good, very low, much lower probability, but not insignificant either, 4%. When that person who thinks that the country cultures is not being undermined by immigration start having economic concerns, that increases the probability a little bit, but not a huge amount, from 4 to 7%. Whereas if that same person who had no concerns whatsoever start having, say, cultural concerns, the red arrows, you see it's a much bigger increase. And however you look at it, cultural concerns always have a much stronger predictive power in the data, regardless of what you control or what sort of things you throw at it. And the reason I know is because initially when I started doing this, I wanted to show that economic concerns mattered more. And I couldn't, find that the predictive power of economic concerns mattered more. And so I was puzzling my mind. I was thinking, what's going on here? And then it hit me that what we were missing was the distribution and the size of groups. So this is exactly the same data. You have 100 people here, and what you're doing is you're literally putting the percentage points of people who think the economy, the impact of immigration on the economy is good or bad, and the same for culture. And then the people in red are the far-right voters. And you see exactly what I was trying to say here, which is that basically, as a ratio, the percentage people who think the impact of immigration on culture is bad, who vote for far right, so the red person as a ratio of everyone else, that's a pretty high incidence, right? So therefore, when you fit a model on this, it's going to have a very strong predictive power. But you still have two here, in absolute terms, who are in the far right electorate in my sample, who are voting for far right even though they think, immigration is great, both in terms of culture and in terms of economy. And these people could have other sorts of grievances. This is just for immigration, obviously. You could think of economic insecurity. Okay, let me just now say something about complex interactions between different forms of insecurities. One problem we have, obviously, is that when I'm culturally insecure and when I'm economically insecure, often, as I said, these two things overlap, and you don't know which one is leading to which one, or whether there's a confounding effect of another factor which is driving both. So you could be in a very deprived community, which has a whole range of problems, and both of those things are making you more economically and culturally insecure. So one way to get at that, which is in some ways perhaps slightly inelegant, is to think of a random shock, which exposes people to a form, in this case, a form of personal insecurity, and to think about how that random shock then affects the likelihood of people supporting far-right parties. So what we did with some colleagues is we said, okay, during the European Social Survey, it is being fielded at different points in time, which you can say, for instance, in the case of Sweden, see here. This is the number of respondents at different points in times. And halfway through the sample, you had terrorist attacks, which you can identify, and therefore, in a way, you can look at the impact of this terrorist attack on support for the far right by comparing people who are just before and people who are just after, noting that obviously who's before and after gets decided way in advance, and it's therefore kind of exogenous to the treatment. Interestingly, we find that this has no effect. So being in a country that has a terrorist attack, in the very short run at least, didn't spur support for the far right. But more interestingly, perhaps, what we did find is that for people who are, how shall I put it, who do not have cultural concerns over immigration, these people who previously probably were not voting for the far right become more likely to support the far right. On the other hand, people who are economically insecure, so say unemployed people, which you can see here, they become less likely to support for far right. And this was kind of a puzzling result because we were thinking, well, actually, if I'm already insecure and something else is making me even more insecure, I should be even more likely to turn to the far right. And what we started thinking about is perhaps that when you really have an existential threat, like a terrorist attack, people start valuing government competence a lot more, and as a result, people who are already kind of insecure in other ways, perhaps, start thinking, well, actually, my protest vote is not so important. I want to securitize, the society or what have you. This is just speculation at this stage. I'm sort of putting it out there for discussion. And just conclude. And thank you for the chair for being kind with the time. I did get interrupted with an alarm, so I think. I think the sort of broader implications of this are that perhaps there is some sort of a even though the phenomenon of far-right party support has been there for a long time, perhaps there's kind of a new winning formula emerging for far-right parties, and I think we need to understand it to fight it in a way, and this new winning formula is trying to capitalize on a range of insecurities that are interacting, and they're not just exogenous, you know, they're not like it's just coming from above. To a large extent, they're the product of policy failures, think of austerity, which has really enhanced insecurities. And so I think, for instance, in the English case, you had local municipalities, they've had 50% of their funding being cut, and then subsequently people said, oh, there's all these immigration flows that are putting the public services under pressure. But no one had stopped to think, hang on a minute, how much of this pressure is actually the result of the funding crisis rather than something else? I mean, obviously, we had thought about it, but it wasn't really in the policy debate. And I think, in a way, if we could just stop some of the policy failures, it would already go a long way in fighting the far right. Economic and cultural insecurity tend to reinforce each other, and they provide a pool of voters with different types of grievances. And, you know, it's not yet clear whether all forms of insecurity sort of play out the same way. But I think the sort of broader lesson as to why they've been successful is because they can attract voters with different insecurities by adapting their supply, and they've done so in a very effective way. First of all, most far-right parties have moved from an ethnic conception of nationalism to a more civic conception of nationalism, you know, emphasizing more quote-unquote common culture and values rather than blood and territory. And that has allowed them to attract people who not have previously voted for far-right. They're unhappy or insecure in various sorts of ways, but they do not sort of converge on this ethnic nationalism. Similarly, you had a move from extremist to radical right parties, which was alluded to before, from often violent proto-fascist or proto-Nazi groups to more radical right, we're rejecting fascism, we're rejecting violence type of groups. And I think of the conversion of the FN from the father to the daughter, you really see that shift in the way they've sort of sold it. And then last but not least, it used to be that a lot of these parties were market liberals, advocating free market economies, but they've moved to a large extent to welfare chauvinism, where they say, we are going to address your insecurities and not the insecurities of the out-group, however we identify that. So, and as a small key therefore, a small final point, you know, perhaps populism and the way we've been talking about is not, you know, explaining what's been going on perhaps as well as we would want to. Thank you.